Good morning and welcome to the 19th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2013. The convener is running a little late, so I'll be convening at least the early part of this morning's meeting. Could I remind everyone to make sure that their mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off as they interfere with the broadcast equipment. The first item of business today is an evidence session on the Scottish Housing Regulator's report on the early impacts of welfare reform on rent arrears. I'd like to welcome from the Scottish Housing Regulator Michael Cameron, Chief Executive, and Kirsty Corbett, Analysis and Research Manager. And could I invite you to make an opening statement outlining the outcomes from the initial research?
Thank you very much, Convener. And thank you for the invitation to present the findings of our recent research into the early impacts of welfare reform on rent arrears of social landlords in Scotland. Perhaps if I start by just introducing who the Scottish Housing Regulator is, and then my colleague will take you through some of the findings from the research itself. We are the independent regulator of social landlords in Scotland. We are directly accountable to the Scottish Parliament. We have a single statutory objective to protect the interests of tenants and others who use the services of social landlords in Scotland. And our functions are to monitor, assess and report regularly on social landlords' performance of housing activities and registered social landlords' financial, health and standards of governance, and to intervene where appropriate. Now, we regulate to protect the interests of around 600,000 social tenants and their families, and that equates to roughly about a fifth of all households in Scotland. We also look to protect the interests of around 40,000 households who apply as homeless or potentially homeless each year. We look after the interests of around 100,000 people who receive factoring services from social landlords. And we protect the interests of around about 500 gypsy traveller families who make use of sites provided by social landlords. So we regulate social landlords, and just for clarity, that's two main groups. There are 183 registered social landlords, mainly housing associations and cooperatives. And we also regulate the landlord and homelessness functions of 32 Scottish local authorities, 26 of whom are still landlords. Turning to our research, the purpose of the research was to gather information that would help us to understand the early impacts on social landlords' rental income that may result from welfare reform changes. We also wanted to find out what early actions landlords were taking and what key challenges they faced as a consequence of changes in tenants' benefits. We published the report on those findings last month, and we will be running a further iteration of the survey. We actually issued that to social landlords on Friday. And we would aim to publish the results from that survey early in the new year. With that, I'll pass over to Kirsty to take you through some of the findings.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to take you very briefly through the background methodology and some of the headline findings from our report. So, as Michael pointed out, our purpose in undertaking this research was to gather information to help us understand some of the early impacts of welfare reform and how they impacted on landlord rent arrears. In terms of methodology, we undertook an online survey of all RSL and local authority landlords in Scotland. We were anticipating responses from 187 landlord organisations, and we had excluded some responses, or excluded themselves, from Abbeyfield societies and some other landlords who had specialist services that weren't perhaps within the remit of impacts of this piece of legislation. The survey was open for 5 weeks or so, and we provided support to landlords to complete that as was required. So our response was very encouraging. The response rate was 84%, representing 157 of the 187 landlords that we had written out to. That was 137 registered social landlords and 20 local authority responses. There were some smaller numbers when it came to analysing specific questions, so I will highlight that where that's been the case. In terms of coverage, the landlord response that we gained from the survey equated to a spread of tenants of around 80% of social landlord tenants in Scotland. We used some administrative data to check off where responses had come from to benchmark that. So that to us suggested that we had a good level of representation of tenants in terms of the respondents to our survey. In terms of the research findings around arrears, the overall picture at the 30th of June 2013 showed a rent arrears position nationally of 3.97%. So that's arrears as a percentage of rental income for that financial year. And that's the standard measure of expressing arrears across Scotland. In terms of financials, that equated to just over £63 million worth of arrears from all the respondents to our survey. In terms of how this sat against a similar arrears position to June in the previous 2 years, which is what we'd asked for within the survey, we saw that arrears seemed to be increasing from June 2011, June 2012 to June 2013. So the picture was one of an increase over time at that point, at June. When we looked at the differences between RSLs, that's registered social landlords, and local authorities, we saw that local authorities tended to have a slightly higher arrears picture across each of the 3 years at June that we had looked at, and that this was again the case for this year in June, but that there was more of an increase for local authority landlords at June this year than there had been for RSL landlords. So in terms of arrears, that was the sort of big picture of what the information that was available to us to look at local authorities and RSLs distinctly. We were then able to use some of the information that we had gathered as part of our ongoing data collection series to look at the differences between March and June figures. So we were able to start to tease out some of the seasonal variations that might underlie some of that shift and some of that increase. And we saw, looking at that this is just for registered social landlords only, because we didn't have the same information for local authorities. So just looking at the picture for registered social landlords, at March 2013, we saw that the percentage arrears level was 3.7%, and the figures that we got from our survey actually showed that that had come down very slightly by June for the same group of landlords. In money terms, it actually equated to an increase of just under £800,000 in terms of the actual financial amount of arrears. That's possible because the rental income for the two different periods of time was slightly different, and that led to a slightly different percentage. Essentially, when we looked back at the March to June change for the previous 2 years, we saw that there was a pattern of reduction between March and June. So there was a seasonal pattern there that seemed to be the case in the previous 2 years as well. However, for this year, from our survey data, we saw that that reduction was smaller between March and June. So we started to feel that there was perhaps something more underlying the bigger picture information. So digging below some of those percentage arrears figures, we saw that there was actually an increase in money terms between March and June of £400,000, and that in previous years, the 2011 and 2012 figures between March and June had actually seen quite substantial decreases of around £3 to £3.5 million. So this year, the big picture was that we saw a slight increase in the amount of money between March and June, whereas in previous years there had been a decrease. Digging below that, again, at an individual landlord level, we saw that around 65%, two-thirds of landlords had seen an increase in their arrears position between March and June, and that in previous years the numbers of landlords showing that increase had been smaller. So that was on the increase as well. So while we see a seasonal pattern of reduction in arrears between March and June, and that's been seen across a number of years previously, the reduction this year was much smaller and there was a slight increase in cash terms. So that's the take-home message in terms of the arrears position. We also looked at under-occupancy, and in terms of under-occupancy, we saw that from our survey data, 1 in 8 tenants were under-occupying at the 30th of June, and that equated to just under 60,000 tenants, or 13% of the tenants that our landlord survey covered. There were slight differences between local authorities and RSLs as far as that was concerned, where local authorities seem to have a slightly higher level of under-occupancy. We asked landlords to estimate the amount of impact they felt that welfare reform was having on their arrears position at the end of June, and their response to that was very consistent and showed that around 68% of them estimated that up to around 5% of their arrears currently at the end of June were arising from welfare reform. A further 19% suggested that up to around 10% of their arrears were arising from welfare reform. Again, local authorities were slightly more likely to estimate a higher impact or a higher percentage of attribution from welfare reform, and there were more of them estimating between 15 and 20% of impact on their arrears position at the end of June. We asked them how confident they were in making those estimates, and again the responses were fairly consistent across all landlords, where around 90% of them were either fairly or very confident about their ability to estimate that level of impact. Again, there were slight disparities between the registered social landlords and the local authorities' position on that question, where local authorities suggested that they were more likely to be unsure or slightly less confident of their ability to estimate that impact at that point in time. We asked about what actions landlords were taking at the end of June to deal with the impacts of welfare reform, and they were consistent across all landlords, and everyone was very focused on actions that supported tenants. The top 3 actions were providing information, advice and guidance to tenants, visiting individual tenants and engaging vulnerable tenants. So there was a very strong focus on tenant support. Again, there was a very, very slight difference in terms of RSLs and local authorities, where local authorities were very slightly less likely to have suggested that they were revising their financial budgets or projections. Possible reasons for that might be around the fact that RSLs are more self-contained businesses, so they might have had a stronger impetus to do that at that point in time. In terms of the challenges that landlords reported that they were facing at the end of June in dealing with the impacts of welfare reform, again, there was a fairly consistent picture across all landlord respondents that we had, and the challenges included increased workload, income reduction, and encouraging tenants to prepare or respond to the impacts. Again, local authorities had highlighted a slightly different pattern in that 60% of local authorities responding to the survey suggested that housing stock availability was actually their biggest challenge, and that was in contrast to RSLs. We felt that it was possibly the case that that response was a sort of underlying driver for some of the other differences between local authorities and registered social landlords, whereby it's perhaps challenges that they feel around housing stock may present slightly different concerns for them. So that is a quick-ish summary of our findings from the research.
Well, thank you, Ms Ms Corbett. That was very comprehensive. I'm just going to ask a couple of opening questions, and if colleagues want to indicate if they want, and I'll take a note. You mentioned there, Ms Corbett, you said, I think you said 1 in 8 tenants are under-occupying. Did I pick that up correctly? Can you tell me, is that on the basis of the UK Government's housing benefit policy, or is this terminology under-occupying something that the Scottish Housing Regulator has used on a historic basis?
Essentially, we asked, our question wording was with reference to the legislation that came into play on the 1st of April around the size criteria and its impact on housing benefit. What number of tenants do you have currently under occupying?
It is rooted in the process of welfare reform. This isn't terminology that you've used historically as an organisation. It's not something you've measured historically as an organisation.
It's certainly not something that we've measured historically. It's not part of our normal annual data set that we collect from social landlords, and it was one of the reasons why we wanted to undertake this specific survey to help us understand some of those dynamics that might be going on with the introduction of this legislation.
Okay. In your report, you identified that the biggest challenge, the top challenge identified by landlords was increased workload. 59% identified that as a challenge, and the second greatest was income reduction, which I suppose would be it was only just behind it, fair enough, 58%, which I suppose that would be the challenge that would lead to concern about arrears, I suppose. But can you quantify what increased workload means a little? I mean, presumably that in itself might relate to work associated with arrears. Is there any way of telling us what was meant by increased workload?
We had gathered some open text responses to ask landlords to give some additional information if they felt that the choices that we had given them within the survey didn't encapsulate their position. So we don't have, we have that text still to be analysed, to be truthful, but we don't actually have any further detail on that particular response. So essentially it was an option that they were able to choose or not choose. Going forward, it's possible that we might be able to dig underneath some of that in the future, in future surveys, and it's possible that it may come out through other pieces of work that will be done by other organisations, but it's not something that I can expand on any further from our survey at the moment, I'm afraid.
But you have had, I think you described it as open text, which is a new term to me, but I think by what I mean, you understand what I understand by you mean by that is people could, fill in additional information as to their experience. So that's something that is available, and you may not be able to quantify it, I suppose, in terms of numbers, but that kind of evidence might still be useful. That's something that you're still gathering and will become available in due course.
Yes.
Okay. The convener has now arrived, but I'll just hand over to Alec, who's identified, and then hand back to you, the convener.
Thank you very much, Deputy Convener. Over recent weeks, we've had evidence from a number of people, and a couple of witnesses have commented specifically on one issue which I wanted to explore to see if you got any information on it. And that is that the increase in arrears, which coincides with the introduction of the under-occupancy charge, doesn't always correlate directly to landlords, doesn't always correlate directly to the increased charge. That is, that there's some evidence that arrears are building up against rent, as well as that is the component that is the under-occupancy charge. Of course, the other thing that's come from our evidence is that this differs substantially from one local authority or one landlord to another. Did you find anything in your information that might assist us in looking more closely at where that's a problem and why that might be a problem?
In this survey, unfortunately, we took the view that we wanted to make this as easy and straightforward for landlords to respond to as possible in order to encourage an initial response from landlords. So the question that we asked around arrears was very much couched in the terms that landlords were most familiar with, and that would provide them with an easily recognisable measure that they were able to respond to quickly. We also should bear in mind that the information that's been given to us for this survey is not audited accounts, it's not year-end, it's not been passed by committees or boards. So bearing those two things in mind, we went for a very straightforward question that essentially said, what is your arrears position at this point in time? And we made that measure align with measures that landlords provide to us through the course of the year in our more standard reporting. So underneath all of that, we weren't able to disaggregate what aspect of arrears arose from different causes, if you like. Our attempt to try and look at some sort of causal attribution was basically in gathering information that we could compare reasonably directly to the year-end data that we already held, that was already published. So we'll be able to gather information at the end of June and compare that to an arrears position at the end of March. But we haven't been able to disaggregate that information any further.
Okay, Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. I had a question just about the kind of general scope of the research thus far. I note on page 3 that you had invited all 187 RSL and local authority landlords to complete the survey, and in total for this survey you received back responses from 157. And I just wonder what was the reason for the other 30 not taking the opportunity to respond to this survey, and do you feel that the uptake may increase over the surveys to come in terms of responses?
Well, there was quite a variety of reasons why those that didn't respond, and when we analysed that, we identified that there was no particular motivation for not participating. As my colleague has already set out, we didn't establish this survey as a regulatory return, given some of the issues that Kirsty has set out in terms of the timing of it, how quickly we were looking for the response back from landlords. We know who did and didn't respond, and in the most recent issuing of the next iteration of the survey, we'll be encouraging all landlords to respond. It's something that, depending on the kind of patterns we're seeing, the broader impacts we're seeing, we may very well consider turning this type of survey into a regulatory return.
Reasons encompass for non-returns thus far? I mean, aside from the fact that it's a voluntary scheme thus far, just maybe not having the ability to collect the info, or just...
Yeah, it was largely administrative reasons that were given for not being able to complete it, rather than anything more substantial than that.
Okay, thank you.
Linda.
Yeah. I was interested, I think you said, Mr Cameron, that you had now put out a further call for evidence for the next pattern. And I'm aware from the report that's been given to us here, it is only 3 months. And so any effects of the bedroom tax in terms of how it directly impacts on tenants, it's a bit too soon to tell. And I notice you're saying too that you didn't analyse the influence of discretionary housing payments, and you didn't seek to examine the effect of landlords' own actions to address the impact. And I wonder if that's something that you will pull in further studies and consultations, or whether you will just go for the straight kind of information that you provided for this 3-monthly one.
The quarterly basis that we're planning to undertake the surveys, I think we're going to try and keep it fairly tight to the key statistical information that will enable us to analyse patterns and movements in arrears. I think the type of analysis that you're referring to would certainly be more qualitative in nature, would be a more substantial undertaking. and indeed we're aware that a number of other organisations are involved in more detailed analysis and study of the impacts of some of the legislative changes. So I think we would look to have our information complement that type of work rather than necessarily look to replicate what is going on elsewhere.
Okay. And in that level, I know that one of your roles is to, how did you put it, as well as protecting tenants' interests, obviously, understanding the risks and challenges landlords face. And I'm also very aware that 3 months down the line, yes, there have been challenges that have been taken up, very, very well. But my own council, South Lanarkshire, for example, has done a lot of work, and I know that housing associations are doing a lot of work to try and maintain people in their homes. I'm particularly concerned about housing associations, community-based housing associations as landlords here, because in your role as regulator, you have to make sure, I presume, that under the financial strictures which they operate and their rules, that they maximise their income. And I wonder how that sits in terms of governance, especially when you're talking about voluntary committee members and any policies that housing associations may take on board, which they see as protecting the interests of their tenants, which you may see in your role as protecting tenants' interests too, but in your role of regulating the finances of a housing association and governance, how you square that?
Yeah, we absolutely are charged with assessing, monitoring and reporting on the financial health of registered social landlords, including housing associations that are based in communities. There is absolutely a balance to be struck between our role in protecting the interests of tenants and that role to protect or to monitor the financial health of RSLs. We don't see those two things as incompatible, however. It's clearly in the interests of tenants that their landlord is financially healthy, able to maintain an appropriate level of service delivery to the tenants, able to maintain and invest in their homes. So I don't see the two as necessarily being separate. But in everything that we do, we would relate that all back to our statutory objective of protecting the interests of tenants.
So, the protecting the interests of tenants would. I'm not trying to be difficult here. I'm just trying to understand how you balance that. So, protecting the interests of tenants is sort of first, if you like, and the role of the landlord and their governance would be secondary.
What we see as important is effective governance and financially healthy landlords are what deliver for tenants. So our focus on good governance and financial health is absolutely about protecting the interests of tenants.
And that would be tenants collectively?
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Pick up a couple of points. One which, just following on from the point that Linda Fabiani just raised on the housing, on the influence of discretionary housing payments. Now, you haven't measured that, but are you aware where discretionary housing payments being made at this stage? In other words, were they a factor? Were some of the tenants and housing associations already applying and benefiting from the discretionary housing payments?
And we didn't collect any information specifically on DHP. And we are aware that there are a number of other studies going on into the impact of discretionary housing payments. Certainly our sense from our wider engagement with landlords is that DHP has had a mitigating impact in the first few months of the period that this survey covered, but we haven't directly looked at that.
Right. In your follow-up surveys, do you think it will you be able to take it into account or not? You're obviously sending out a new survey today. It's going to be published in January. Will it take into account, will it measure at all the impact of discretionary housing payments?
We haven't sought to measure the impact of any of the potential mitigating actions and measures that are in place. Again, what we wanted to do was maintain some consistency with the previous survey so that we could track movements and patterns over the time period of the survey. So we haven't asked any question directly about DHP.
Just on some of the figures, can you just, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on the difference between the figure that you've come up with, the scale of the impact of the removal of housing benefit was, the bedroom tax was 60,000, or just under 60,000 on your survey, but just over 80,000 in the local authority survey. Which is the more accurate figure, or which one can we work with, or are they both accurate, as it were?
It's our understanding that the COSLA and Scottish Government research, which identified the 82,500 figure in terms of impact, was done on a more sort of administrative basis. So they used working age housing benefit recipients and tracked that through a sort of administrative source, and they also had a wider coverage of local authority areas and were able to input the figures for those who did not respond to their survey. I think only 2 local authorities didn't respond to their survey, and they were able to use other information to make up that number, essentially, so that they had a sort of 100% coverage. Our survey was based on respondents only, and we're quite happy to say that's not 100% coverage. On a very sort of rough maths basis, it's likely that the discrepancy in coverage might well be the factor there in the difference between our 60,000 figure and the 82,500 figure.
It's not, though. It's not a reflection of whether tenants themselves are identifying themselves to either to their RSL as being affected by the bedroom tax.
That's not something that we would have pulled out or that we were aware of, no.
Okay. And also, just in terms of the impact on both sectors, there are a number of differences. Well, perhaps you could just enlighten me. Are there differences between the demographics of the demographic spread of residents in council housing compared to a housing association? Are they more likely to be older? Are they, in which case, not affected by the bedroom tax, pensionable age, in other words? Are there more in one sector or another in receipt of housing benefit? Are rent levels higher in housing association properties generally? I would have thought they were than council properties, but I wonder if you could just expand on some of those differences that exist.
Personally, I'm not aware of an awful lot of those differences.
No, right.
I don't know whether you have more information on that.
No, I mean, we have a range of information that we've collected over a number of years on some of those measures for registered social landlords, but we don't have that same information for local authorities, so we're not able to do the same kind of direct comparison. Where we are able to do some comparisons, we're aware that in general RSL's rents will be a bit higher than local authorities' rents, and we have some information on the demographics in RSLs, but of course that will vary quite significantly between individual RSLs, not least because some RSLs are specialist providers who will provide homes for people of particular age or particular demographics. So there's variation within that global figure as well.
And just again, in terms of the impact, you got quite slightly different response from the local authority landlords from the housing associations. And the implication is that, perhaps I'm wrong drawing this conclusion, that the local authorities seem to have been slightly harder hit than the housing associations. The increase in rent arrears is slightly higher, the numbers are slightly higher. That's the case? From
the responses that we have, yes. I would point out that 6 of the 26 local authorities who have housing stock didn't respond to the survey. we still had 75% response rate for local authorities, so that's still reasonably representative, but it's our understanding that that's the picture, yes.
Did the major, the large local authorities all respond?
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Okay, Kevin.
Thank you, Convener. And obviously, this is a snapshot of the first 3 months. And you have the biggest challenges in that 3-month period on page 11. I wonder, as you continue to monitor the situation, if you could give us an idea of whether other challenges are likely to come into play here, and whether there was anything in the narrative that local authorities put forward about other challenges. I'm thinking along the lines of a possibility of the cutting of services, drawback in terms of capital expenditure, financial instability, and particularly in smaller landlords, and the possibility that some local authorities or housing associations may turn around and say that they're unable to reach the Scottish housing quality standard. Is that being played out in the narrative? Are these the kind of things that you're going to ask in your second round of monitoring of this?
First of all, just to answer the first part of your question, it's those things very specifically are not arising from the narrative as we understand it at the moment in great detail, but we offered landlords a range of options to choose from to identify their challenges based on some previous qualitative work that had been done by the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Going forward into our next survey, we've actually asked more open-ended questions, allowing landlords to be able to identify those challenges in a bit more detail for themselves, hopefully perhaps providing more detail on the kinds of issues that you've identified yourself there.
I wonder if Mr Cameron's got anything to add.
Not in terms of findings from the survey. I think the kind of issues that you've raised are very much those that we as a regulator will be having a very keen eye to. We will want to understand not just the impact in terms of rent arrears, but what the broader impact will be in terms of landlords' capacity to deliver for tenants, given the potential risks to their cash flows and their revenues. And we'll want to understand what that may mean in terms of any impacts on planned maintenance programmes, any impact on the level of other service delivery to tenants, and indeed the impact on rent levels more generally. So those are things that we will be monitoring closely over the coming period.
A question which may not be able to be answered is, do you think as people were completing this survey, they were thinking probably those short-term impacts of the first 3 months rather than the possible long-term impacts that the bedroom tax and other welfare reform may cause them?
They may have been. Obviously, it's not possible for us to comment what may have been on the minds of respondents at the point where they were doing that. Certainly, I think from broader discussions with landlords, they are aware of the potential longer-term impacts that may come out of these legislative changes. Many of them are starting to give consideration to their longer-term business plans and what the impact may be of reductions in revenues on those plans. So it's something that we are aware that landlords are giving significant thought to.
Obviously, even in good times, we have seen some associations struggle in terms of finances, and we've heard comments from the regulator in the past about various associations. Can I ask if you as the regulator will be paying closer attention to the finances and to capital expenditure because of the impacts of welfare reform?
We are a risk-based regulator, so what we do on a continuous basis is assess the risks to landlords and to their ability to continue to deliver for their tenants. We have an annual process that will look at the financial health of landlords. This is registered social landlords. We have a narrower role with local authorities, but with registered social landlords, we, on an annual basis, will consider their financial health, their position, by looking at not just their accounts information, but also their financial projections. Welfare reform and the potential impact on revenues are one of the top risks that we're focusing on. We've just launched our annual risk assessment process, and welfare reform is right up there in terms of the risks we're focusing on.
One of the top risks, what would the other risks
There are a
be?
range of ones that we'll look at. There are a couple of others that we are aware in terms of financial health that we're focusing on. That's including the impact of increases in landlord pension contributions to fund historical liabilities that are with landlords from the Housing Association pension scheme. We're also very aware of the risk of increases to the cost of borrowing on landlords. So there's a range of financial risks that we have a very close eye to and that we will use when we are assessing each individual landlord's position in relation to those matters. That will then be translated into a regulation plan if we feel we need to engage with a landlord because they seem or they may have more exposure to those types of risks.
I have one final question, Convener, which is slightly off of this particular topic, and that's round about reclassification of housing. And I wonder if during the second tranche of analysis, whether you will be looking at whether there has been reclassification from, for example, specialist housing, sheltered or amenity into mainstream housing to try and find more one-bedroom accommodation. And I wonder if that will have an impact in terms of the service that's provided to tenants across the country. I wonder if that's the kind of thing that you'll look at too.
We haven't included that as analysis in the next iteration of the survey. That's something that we may be able to identify through our normal annual data collection from landlords. Within that, we do ask about the nature of the accommodation, the size of the accommodation. So if there are any significant changes in patterns there, it may be possible for us to identify it through that annual data collection.
And are you going to adapt your annual data collection to take due cognizance of the impacts of welfare reform?
Well, we have issued collection requirements already for landlords, and that relates particularly to the Scottish Government's Social Housing Charter. So those are set out already, and they are. There's a number of the measures that are pretty consistent with the type of information we've collected through the survey. So not only will we be able to monitor that information on this quarterly basis, we'll also be able to track it in that annual basis as well and give us a broader feel for movements and patterns that may be emerging.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin. Back to Linda. You want to
Just a very small thing to follow on from Kevin Stewart. It was just we were talking about the risks faced by RSLs, and I'm aware some of them are very small, tightly run organisations. And I just wonder about the effect of risks, creating bigger risks in other fields. For example, levels of debt having an ongoing risk impact on the ability to borrow at reasonable rates, the ability to complete capital programmes and maintenance programmes. And is that something that a bit of work has been done on by yourselves to try and mitigate some of that, to try and help out?
We as a regulator certainly have a very close eye to landlords' level of debt and also to their revenue streams. And obviously the principal revenue stream for all landlords is rent. So any impact on that revenue stream as a consequence of changes in benefit is something which we're very alive to, and we're also very conscious that lenders to the sector are very alive to the potential impacts on the creditworthiness of the sector as a consequence of some of these legislative changes.
Any other questions from committee? I just wanted to follow up on something that was being discussed when I came into the room. My apologies for being late and not hearing your opening statement. But this issue of disaggregation has come up repeatedly when we've been discussing the impact of, or how to measure the impact of the bedroom tax in particular. Some people have said it's going to be quite complex to break down the differentials that are emerging between arrears which may already have existed in the system and those that are going to be as a result directly of the bedroom tax. You've indicated that you want to see that sort of disaggregation at some point in your research. Is getting that information going to be difficult? Or because there has been arguments that, you know, when the bedroom tax kicked in, we knew the date when that happened. Patterns of rent accounts were known prior to that date. Changes in those patterns of rent accounts will be known after that date. Is it as simple as that, or will it be a complex form of data analysis that's going to be required?
We aren't seeking to break down the level of arrears into those component elements. That's for two reasons. Firstly, that's not actually necessary for us to have that information to enable us to effectively regulate landlords. We're more interested in the aggregate level of rent arrears and the impact that may be having on landlords' financial position. We also do see some practical difficulties for landlords in identifying different components or different reasons or origins for arrears, and that's likely to become more difficult still as time goes on, and certainly as we get further into the proposed changes from the welfare reform legislation. So we do see some practical difficulties in being able to identify exactly which arrears relate to which particular welfare reform measure.
So when you do disaggregate, what will you be looking for then?
Just for clarification, we're not looking to disaggregate the arrears figures that landlords give us. We're looking for them to give us the level of arrears which they are facing at that aggregate level.
Okay. That's helpful. Kirsty, did you want to?
I was just going to add that we do have an additional question in our survey that's just gone out to last week, the second round survey, where we ask exactly the same questions on rent arrears using the same measure as we have in the first round, but we also ask whether or not landlords are able to identify a monetary value for arrears arising directly from the impact of the under-occupancy charge, and that's a yes or no question. And then if they can they say what value they would attribute to that, and if they can't, can they give us some detail on what the challenges and what the barriers to them being able to provide that information might be. So while, as Michael says, we're not seeking to go forward and disaggregate that information on an ongoing way, we're taking the opportunity to ask the question about whether or not generally landlords could start to identify monetary values around for that reason, and what the challenges in them doing so might be if they're not able to do that.
And that'd be quite helpful to know that, Ken.
Just wanted to clarify, because on that, the figure you got back from your survey was that the vast majority, over 90%, were able to identify it, and that over 90% said they were very confident about that. Yeah.
What we did ask them was if were they able to estimate it. So it was very much an estimate that landlords gave us rather than a hard figure.
We seem to have exhausted our question, but I found your report very interesting. I look forward to seeing the future work that you do, and it might be possible that we could have you back in front of us to discuss the outcomes of that research as well. And we look forward to seeing that. But thanks very much for your contributions this morning. I'll suspend the meeting for 5 minutes to change over our witnesses. Thank you. Okay, our second item of business this morning is to take evidence on discretionary housing payments, and I'd like to welcome Annette Finnan, Head of Area Services of Housing at South Lanarkshire Council, Cliff Dryborough, who is the Benefits Manager at the City of Edinburgh Council, Susan Donald, who is the Benefits Manager at Aberdeenshire Council, and Lorna Campbell, Service Manager at Revenues and Benefits at Dumfries and Galloway Council. I'd like to invite all the members of the panel to make a short opening statement and then to set out issues from their perspective areas, and then we'll open it up to questions. I think, Annette, you were going to open, if that's all right.
Thank you. Just to start with, I want to thank the committee for inviting South Lanarkshire to give evidence this morning. As you'll know, we submitted written evidence, which you've already received. Just some context, South Lanarkshire Council is the 5th largest council in Scotland. We have just under 25,000 tenants, over 60% of whom are in receipt of either housing benefit or partial housing benefit. Since the introduction in April of the welfare reform changes, DHP we've seen is playing a significant role in South Lanarkshire in supporting tenants facing financial hardship as a result of the social sector size criteria restrictions. We have around 5,000 tenants who have been affected, which is split approximately 4,000 South Lanarkshire Council tenants and 1,000 RSL tenants. South Lanarkshire Council has experienced a significant rise in DHP applications so far this year. These have risen from 396 at the same point last year to over 2,000, an increase of over 400%. With the additional funding from the Scottish Government, we are now better placed to meet the level of demand, although I would emphasise that the total DHP budget that we've been allocated, just over £1.2 million, does not meet the shortfall in housing benefit. South Lanarkshire Council introduced a revised DHP policy from the 1st of April to take account of the changes being introduced as part of the Welfare Reform Programme. The policy has been widely publicised and promoted to encourage claims from tenants and those supporting tenants. The Council's policy is flexible, makes awards of between 3 to 12 months and targets priority groups including tenants living in significantly adapted properties and customers with disabilities and those with serious health issues. 1,476 successful awards have been made so far, the majority of those, nearly 80%, being claimants affected by the under-occupancy rules. Over 900 of these households have been assisted to apply for DHP by the Council's Specialist Benefits of Changing team that we established at the beginning of the year and who are providing a wide range of support and advice to tenants affected by the welfare reform changes. Whilst we've been highly proactive and made good progress in identifying and assisting tenants in need, the current arrangements for the administration of the scheme and the additional supports provided have created additional work and costs for the Council. Following the announcement of additional funding, which has allowed the Council to top up our DHP budget to the maximum, we have further revised our qualifying criteria to assist tenants who are struggling to pay the under-occupancy charge. We still have a large number of tenants who require support. 2,688 of the 3,868 council tenants currently affected by the under-occupancy changes owe rent arrears. 1,639 of these have arrears that relate solely to the under-occupancy charge. And through the application of DHPs, we can reduce the impact of these arrears, although I would note that for many customers with significant prevailing health issues, the award of DHP will not address their long-term and continuing needs. To date, the Council has committed almost half of its DHP budget, over £560,000, and we will continue to work to ensure effective targeting of the additional DHP funding to those most in need of help and to achieve maximum budget spend by the end of the financial year. However, locally, it's too early to assess how DHPs are mitigating the impact of welfare reform and their role in preventing arrears. As highlighted in Professor Kenneth Gibbs' recent research on the bedroom tax, DHP is playing a significant role in assisting tenants facing financial hardship and in the management of arrears, and the uncertainty around the continuity of this funding in the future is one of our key concerns. While the Scottish Government has pledged funding for 14-15, we still await the DWP's announcement of next year's budget and whether or not local authorities will in any way have the ability to carry budget forward. We are therefore aiming to spend all of our budget by the end of the year. Securing the continuity of the DHP at similar levels of funding, especially for the next year, is critical to help ourselves and other councils respond to the challenges of under-occupation and mitigate the impact on households as well as on the business impacts for the council. Thank you.
Lorna, do you want to add some comments?
Again, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting Dumfries and Galloway here to give evidence today. In April of this year, the DWP allocation of DHP to Dumfries and Galloway was 232,000, and the council took a local decision to top that up by a further 262,000 at that point. Administration of DHP in Dumfries and Galloway normally was sat within the benefits team, and we decided at that point to have an actual discretionary spend team that sat with Scottish Welfare Fund at the time as well to concentrate on the administration of both discretionary budgets. At that time, we'd done some estimates of the impact of welfare reform within Dumfries and Galloway, the incorporated size criteria restrictions, as well as the impact of benefit cap, increased non-debt deductions and the change to LHA. And at that point, we estimated the impact to our tenants in the region was going to be in the round of 1.1 million. So at that point, our DHP fund was not going to meet what we estimated the overall demand. So our procedures at that time were primarily based on an income and expenditure assessment of any tenant that applied into the fund. And we looked at what expenditure was, and where expenditure was more than the income was an automatic award. If it was less, we took some priority cases and concentrated on people with disabilities and properties that were larger than was their determined needs, kinship carers and fosterers, as well as single parent families where there was joint care of children in homes. Those were our priority cases. Obviously, with the announcement of the increased funding, firstly from the DWP in July, with Dumfries and Galloway, we were fortunate enough to have a rural uplift from DWP of 488,000, and then the Scottish Government announcement of 970,000. That substantially increased our DHP fund for the area, which meant we have twice revised our DHP policy and procedures. For size criteria, the amount of the fund now means that for the number of people impacted in Dumfries and Galloway, we estimate that was 900,000 was going to be the actual shortfall. So the fund now means that we could meet potentially the full need of size criteria within Dumfries and Galloway. So we've revised our procedures and relaxed the financial assessments quite considerably. And for some in the size criteria, we've removed the financial assessments, which in turn has allowed us to relax the application process as well, where initially someone had to fill in it was a 4-page application form with a variety of questions and a full income and assessment. But for those affected by size criteria and in specifically the disabled categories, we could remove that financial assessment and therefore make it an easier application. And in many cases, that's a phone application to the tenant, which has increased uptake. Certainly the demand on DHP has been quite considerable, and we've seen something like a 900% increase in applications. We were averaging 30-40 applications this time last year, where this month alone we've seen over 500 applications to the fund. Dumfries and Galloway is a stock transfer authority, so we don't have our own housing stock, so we've worked very closely with our RSLs in the area in developing our procedures and in contacting tenants, and very much have a joint approach with them and contacting tenants and encouraging uptake into the DHP. To date, we have spent over 500,000 of our allocation so far, so it's just over 34% has actually been allocated and committed to the end of the year. What we are also seeing in our area, being quite a rural area, is quite a demand on the fund from people who are experiencing higher food bills, higher fuel bills, higher travel costs. So while welfare reform has had a significant impact, we're also seeing an increased demand because of that, the increased expense in households. Again, today, over 50% of people impacted by size criteria have been awarded DHP so far. And we're also having a look at other internal procedures to sit alongside DHP. So a number of applicants may already have a housing benefit overpayment in play, or may have a shortfall because of other areas in their housing benefit, be it a means, because of the means test. So we're also reviewing those areas as well for example, in the case of overpayments, will review the level of overpayment or recovery rate, or if indeed it's appropriate due to financial circumstances, we may write off an overpayment rather than apply DHP, or both if circumstances warrant it. As Annette's already mentioned, while we have quite a significant fund for this year, what we're very keen to say to tenants and work with tenants is that this is a sticking plaster at this point in time, and come April next year we have no guarantee of what the DWP funding is going to be, or how much of Scottish Government funding will also come towards. So we are working with tenants to work on underlying issues, if there's debt issues there or if there's fuel poverty there, what can we do locally to actually work with tenants to try and improve their situation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Susan.
I'd like to thank the committee for inviting Aberdeenshire to give evidence today. At the start of 2013, our discretionary housing payment budget was expected to be £401,738, of which the council contributed £241,043. That budget was less than half of the estimated reduction in housing benefit arising from the introduction of the size criteria in the social rented sector and the benefit cap. The Council therefore revised its discretionary housing payment policy, and colleagues from Housing and Social Work were involved in drawing up the revised policy. And what we aimed to do was prioritise those at risk of homelessness, the disabled, foster and kinship carers, as well as those who were already experiencing financial difficulties, as evidenced through the rent arrears. Initially, given the limited nature of the budget, decision makers awarded 25, 50, 80 or 100% of the shortfall, depending on the individual circumstances of the applicant. At the end of July, the UK Government announced revised discretionary housing payment funding, which increased our DHP budget to £1,487,063, of which £892,238 would have been expected to come from the Council's own budget. The Scottish Government has since allocated Aberdeenshire Council £883,262 to enable us to meet that contribution. As a result of this, the increased budget, the DHP policy was revised, and any awards made now equate to either 80% or 100%, again depending on the circumstances of the applicant. The revised policy also includes provision for an additional 4-week extended payment of housing benefit where the claimant has moved into work and would otherwise see a reduction in their housing benefit. And this is to help applicants adjust to and sustain employment, particularly where there's travel costs involved. Aberdeenshire Council has received 809 applications for discretionary housing payments at the end of October. That represents an increase of 458% on the previous year. And so far we've made 712 awards and have incurred expenditure of £252,901. We've also established that 805 households of those affected by the size criteria and 15 affected by the benefit cap have not yet applied for discretionary housing payments. And therefore we're currently undertaking a take-up campaign aimed at encouraging those households to access DHP. To date, 309 households have been contacted and around 30% have already submitted an application. Those who've not responded will be contacted by phone and an application will be taken online. We're working hard across a range of services to do all that we can to encourage people to access DHP. But we're very mindful of the fact that this is a discretionary pot of money. There's absolutely no guarantee that we will have this level of funding going forward. And bearing in mind the shift to universal credit in a number of months' time, we're very much focused on helping customers adjust to the fact that they will have some kind of rent liability to pay at the end of this. So hence the reason that we've taken the decision to make the majority of awards 80%. Thank you.
Once more, I'd like to thank, on behalf of the City Edinburgh Council, for inviting here today. For 2013-14, the Council City of Edinburgh Council set a DHP policy aligned to the DWP contribution of 1.4 million. So in other words, no top-up. So what was included in the policy was a lot of categories around DHP may be paid, because, as I say, it was very much tailored to a lower contribution. That spend had been monitored very strictly until around the end of September, where we had paid at that point out or committed around 800,000 of the 1.4 million. Our refusal rate at that time was around 35%, and the feeling was that in 95% of those cases, the refusal had been done because people could actually afford to bridge the gap. Following the announcement of additional funding, the Council's budget was topped up to 3.555 million. Right there and then, the Council allowed delegated powers to alter the policy ahead of a revised policy going to committee on the 5th of November. What that meant was that a number of the maybe awards that had been in the previous policy were now moved into the will pay category to maximise the award of DHP. In addition, we relaxed the income and expenditure rules significantly. So the position currently is, having started off from that lower base, obviously, without the top-up, is that we have now spent a third of our 3.555 million. The actions we're currently taking look to spend the remainder of that money by the end of the financial year. And I think this is the key point. Currently, we have just completed looking at revising the some 2,500 awards we'd made up till the end of September, in line with the new policy. And we're individually contacting the 2,500 tenants that did not apply, in other words, are affected by under-occupancy, but did not apply for DHP. So we've sent them an application and a letter and a prepaid envelope, and our housing officers are either contacting them or knocking them on their door, really trying to actively encourage them to apply for DHP. As I say, we hope that everybody will apply, but that will determine whether or not we can expend the 3.555 million at the end of the year. I would reflect my colleagues' concerns around the issues of funding going forward and what impact this might have on people's willingness to change in line with welfare reform. We set up a dedicated team to deal with DHP in April this year, really to get uniformity of decision and fairness. That was a team of 4 at the time. I've now had to increase that team to 10 to deal with a review of the existing awards and in anticipation of the doubling of number of awards between now and the end of the financial year. That concludes.
Thanks very much to all 4 of you for your contributions, and it's quite clear from all of the contributions that you've made so far, and especially from the paper produced by South Lanarkshire, which was very helpful. There is a huge disparity between the supply or the availability of DHP and the demand. Not all local authorities found the resources to top up to the maximum at the outset. Some have now, or I think all have now, given the additional funds found by the Scottish Government. Can you give us an explanation as to why it was felt, given that you were all aware of the demand, that it was not possible to top up to the maximum at the outset? Whoever one wants to go first.
In terms of South Lanarkshire, no decision was made at the outset to top up to the max. What was decided and agreed was we would have a monitoring brief on the level of demand. And that went on during the summer months as we saw applications increase. The council was able at that point to consider whether we should top up, and were about to top up through our committee approval route additional finance for this purpose when obviously we received the additional funding from the Scottish Government. We had already taken steps to increase resources in trying to encourage applicants to apply and tenants to apply for DHP, and also in the processing of it. So we had made provision to be able to process any increased demand, but we hadn't topped up the budget because we were waiting to see what the demand was going to be.
For similar position?
Similar in Dumfries and Galloway. We had committed to top up by 262, which wasn't the full allocation we could top up. I think Dumfries and Galloway had a pot of money at that point. We had money set aside for impacts of welfare reform, and quite a considerable amount of that was put into advice services in preparation for overall impacts going forward. But again, the 262 was committed to DHP with a review to monitor going forward, and it's reviewed on a monthly basis to a council committee, the current spend rate, obviously prior to the full top-up that was available to us in October.
But a sort of follow-up question then would be, if you had already found a percentage of what was available to top up from your own resources, and then the Scottish Government provided the amount that would allow maximum top up, did the money that you had already allocated stay in that area, or has it been dissipated out into wider council budgets now?
Working on a report because the money we've got from the Scottish Government has taken us up to our limit. We can't use what was originally set aside by the council to top it up any further. So there is a report going forward that will remain within the welfare reform remit. We're looking at using some of that money to actually support the discretionary spend team. And as colleagues have alluded, the administrative burden of all this extra funding has been quite considerable. So we're looking at using some of that money to bolster that team and actually have dedicated money advice officers who will go out and visit applicants and look at the surrounding issues underneath applications.
I'm not singling you out for this question, Lorna, if anybody else could answer, but I do want to come on to the administrative cost, but I want to stick first of all to this. The money that was already available, where has it gone now that the Scottish Government has made funding available? I know of at least one local authority which topped up the DHP to its maximum and had an additional housing support fund because they knew that the demand was going to be so great. So while technically the DHP can only be increased by 150%, other local authorities found that 150% and a bit more. Is it likely that your local authorities are going to do the same?
We took the decision very early on in the budget process not to top up, and as has been said by one of my colleagues, wait and see what the demand was, monitoring it quite rigidly on a monthly basis. There had been a lot of discussion about whether to or not top up ahead of the Scottish Government announcement, but it didn't actually happen.
Susan, did you want to add something?
The Aberdeenshire took the decision in June to top up its full allocation of 241,043, but it set out very clearly from the 1st of April that there was always the intention to ask for that money, but again we wanted to see what the demand was going to be like.
Well, that's absolutely fine. As I said, it was just to get an idea of what the thinking was behind the original decisions in relation to the topping up. But you did bring me on to my second question. You've talked about the increase in the demand, or the increase in those who have been affected, which requires the criteria to be changed in some cases, but also to increase the amount of payments. How much in additional administration has that cost the local authorities, and has that impacted on your ability to get money into people who require support?
What we found in South Lanarkshire is where we have a benefits a changing team that's dedicated. It consists of 10 members of staff, largely who formerly worked in the housing field, who are proactively working to encourage tenants to apply. And that obviously is resource intensive. It is face-to-face visits, it's going out to see tenants in all parts of South Lanarkshire. It's dealing with on the phone, as well as making the actual assessment of their financial situation and level of hardship, and making that application for them or assisting them to do that. In addition, we don't have a backlog necessarily of DHP applications, but the 400% increase has led to an increased burden in terms of the administration on the benefits part of their service, and we have increased by 4 members of staff those who are merely processing those applications and putting the benefit into applicants' benefit accounts. There's also been increased admin and monitoring, not only the level of uptake of DHP, but also the impact on rent arrears. So that process is resource intensive as well. We've also, as a council, provided additional permanent and temporary money matters advice staff as well. So it's over the full gambit of money advice, budgeting advice, encouraging tenants to apply for assistance, whether it be from DHP or the Scottish Welfare Fund, to the actual admin process of placing the DHP into applicants' and tenants' rent accounts.
Cliff, you mentioned that you'd already added a member of staff. Is that likely to be looked at again? Is the demand increasing?
We formed a dedicated team of 4 in April, as I said, but to get over that initial increase, I drafted people in from my benefits processing teams to ensure that we didn't go into a big backlog position. And once we got past that hump in April, May, those processing people went back. But when the additional funding was awarded, there was no way we could cope with dealing with mainline benefits processing and the amount of DHP. So we have utilised some of the additional Scottish Government funding for additional staff and have increased our DHP number of staff by 2.5 times currently to deal with this now new hump of the additional awards. And we just wait, we'll have to see how that goes.
Authorities is pretty much the same picture, yeah.
We appointed slightly more than the number of officers to administer the Scottish Welfare Fund than had been required, with the idea of having the DHP administered by the same group of staff. And in addition, we've reprioritised workload for the existing benefit staff. And we don't have a backlog as such of discretionary housing payments. But given that we're in the middle of the take-up campaign, we do expect to see an increase in the number of applications again. And what we'll tend to do is look at that in the sense of providing perhaps opportunities for staff to work extra hours to pick up on that.
I'll open it up to members of the committee. I'll go first to the Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you for your evidence this morning. A number of you, most of you, mentioned the importance. We certainly talked about the future funding levels for DHP, and I think it was Annette spoke of the importance of trying to secure essentially the same level as we see just now. And we know that the Scottish Government, subject to the approval of this Parliament for its budget, has committed to that. But my understanding was the DWP were always planning on squeezing the amount of money going forward. And are you, as local authorities, in direct dialogue with the DWP? What are they telling you about what their plans are?
My colleagues from South Lanarkshire who are in dialogue with the DWP are not able to give me in the housing service an indication of exactly when they'll make their announcement. My understanding is, though, that they are aiming to squeeze and a 10% reduction has been mooted. Whether that's going to be accurate or not, that's certainly what's been I've heard anyway, but whether that is, hopefully that won't transpire to be the case. There are other challenges, not just in the whatever percentage cut there would be and the impact that would have in the funding from the Scottish Government, but also the difference across Scotland and how they calculated it in terms of their formula and how different local authorities were awarded different levels of DHP. And certainly South Lanarkshire has benefited from been able to use in its entirety the DHP award that we've been given historically, and that's impacted on our award this year. However, it's certainly not the demand that is there in terms of those who are experiencing the shortfall in housing benefit.
Back to issues of demand, because you provide some fairly stark figures, but I wonder if the other local authorities could tell us if they are aware of any dialogue with the DWP. Does it tally with what Annette's saying?
I don't, again, I'll just reflect what my colleague said, that we're not aware of any figures as yet. What does seem to have happened historically is if you spend up to your DWP contribution in the past, you tend to get the same again, which is a strange way of allocating funding maybe. But
are we expecting that approach this time? I mean, given that they've said that they are intending on squeezing, do you think they're going to stick to that?
Well, whether they take 10% off and then allocate the remainder on the basis of what's been spent, I don't know. We've not been told, I don't.
See the point you're making, yeah.
I'm not aware of any discussions, and I fully expect it'll be December, January time before we get any sort of announcement.
I suppose that, I mean, feel free to say you can't possibly answer this, but are you hopeful? What's your expectation?
Aberdeenshire spent £20,602 on DHP last year. We're certainly working hard to make sure that we spend at least the DWP allocation this year.
But I mean, presumably, every local authority is going to do that if that's the historic basis. So, given that the DWP has already said, presumably they're not going to go on the basis of previous allocation if they are intending to squeeze. I mean, I suppose, feel free to say you can't answer it if you don't feel you can, but are you hopeful that the DWP will not squeeze the amount of discretionary housing payment funding?
I would have thought the backdrop is that change was expected. That, you know, it is, DHP is supposed to be just, you know, a temporary measure while people change. Whether they can or not is a completely separate argument. You know, whether they can gain employment, downsize, get somebody in, whatever it may be. But I would have thought there would be an expectation there that some sort of change should have happened, and therefore that you would not need the same amount of DHP in the future. That's what I would take from it, but we wait for the announcement.
I think we're probably usefully explored it as far as we can. In the paper from South Lanarkshire Council, which was very helpful, Annette, you set out that as at 8th of November 2013, South Lanarkshire Council received 2,081 applications for DHP, of which 1,918 have been processed. This compares to only 396 applications received for the same period last year, representing an increase of 425%, which I thought was an astronomical figure until Lorna said that they've experienced a 900% increase. I mean, I suppose the first question is, are you surprised at this stark increase? And the question to the other local authorities would be if you have any information as to what your experience has been.
I'm not surprised by the level of demand. I mean, we had a fairly, I mean, our DHP allocation last year was 75,000, of which, you know, was spent. But we anticipated, certainly with the demand of the size criteria, that we were going to be inundated with applications. And I think, as at last week, we had something like just over 2,500 we've now got. So, yes, it was expected.
And the local authorities that didn't, I don't know if maybe you don't have the figures to hand, but are you aware of what the percentage increase in demand has been?
Yes, we've had a 458% increase in applications. We went from 145 to 809. And it was anticipated. I think what perhaps wasn't was the fact that there's still a significant number of those affected by the size criteria who haven't actually applied for DHP, despite an extensive campaign to communicate its availability, including training to those that support vulnerable households. You know.
But they haven't applied. You still experienced a 450% increase. And Cliff, I don't know, do you have information for Edinburgh?
It's just over 500%. But as I said earlier, the key point is 50% of those affected have yet to apply. And, you know, it's not through lack of contact, but it seems that I'm being told by my housing colleagues, and I think I said we've now sent out an individual app, prepaid envelope, everything. There's all sorts of contact being made. We've even tried to divide that number of cases, the 2,500 cases we've got left, across the housing officer caseload so that they can knock on people's doors. Quite often they can't even get people in. There's been a high attempt at trying to get these people to engage, but that is going to be the key to whether we spend the money by the end of the year.
And one final question, if I may, Convener, I noted again in the paper from South Lanarkshire Council that despite the huge increase in number of applications, the success rate is actually fairly stable. It's down slightly, but not that much. It was 80% of the 396 applications in the period last year were successful, and of the 1,918 which had been processed so far as of 8th of November this year, it was 76.5%, so it's fairly stable. I mean, is that the case in the other local authorities? Is the success rate of applications, notwithstanding the huge increase in number of applications you've all experienced, is the success rate roughly stable from last year to this?
Our Aberdeenshire success rate is a lot higher this year. It was sitting in 2012-13, of the 145 applications, 53 were successful. This year, out of the 761 that have actually been processed at the end of October, 712 have been successful.
And ours, Dumfries and Galloway is pretty similar, but at the start of the year we were really looking at probably a 50% success rate, but with the increased funding we're now looking at 85–90% success rate of applications.
We were at 65% success rate, and just looking at October on its own, we're now at 80, and I anticipate that going to 90, at least 90.
It's higher, okay, that's useful. Thank you.
Okay. Linda, to follow by Kevin.
Yeah, just a quick question following up on one of Jamie's there. The people that are not engaging, I think you put it in it, a significant number have not engaged, and we've heard from others that that's the same. Are these people all in arrears?
From South Lanarkshire's point of view, then no. There are a substantial number of tenants whose housing benefit has been reduced due to the under-occupancy changes, who are in arrears, who have not engaged. There are, and we are targeting and focusing at the moment on that group of tenants. But there are also tenants who have not engaged, who are making the payments, and that's the unknown. We don't know what hardship these tenants in particular are in, and whether they would qualify for some assistance. So we are seeing, through DHP and through payments, a quarter of our tenants affected have nil arrears. One of the difficulties is separating that figure. However, they are not coming forward for help, but there are also a significant proportion who are in arrears, who have still not engaged. And for tenants who in excess of £200 more than the under-occupancy deduction, and within South Lanarkshire we had a look at this at September, only 15% of those tenants had engaged with us in terms of any assistance. So once again, we are focusing not only on all of our tenants affected, but specifically trying to reach some of the harder to reach tenants who are struggling financially and are in arrears.
Would that be a general sort of thing? Cliff, you mentioned, I think, 50% hadn't engaged.
50% across all sectors that were affected by under-occupancy have not applied for DHP. So that is our big push in the, already and in the coming months.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that relates, Convener, to what we were talking about earlier with the regulator, about, after 3 months it's very, very difficult to get any qualitative information at all. It's as time goes on and we see this building up. The other thing I wanted to ask about was, again, in the regulator's report, it was quite clear that for local authorities, housing stock availability was the most commonly selected challenge. Now, I know from meeting Lorna before, there's a particular issue in Dumfries and Galloway with one-bedroom properties. And I just wonder to the extent which the lack of properties available, that even if people were willing to move and be helped to move, it's impossible because the stock's just not there. I wonder how much this impacts and how much discretionary payments and an estimate are having to be used for that kind of scenario.
Yeah, we do have a significant lack of one-bedroom properties from all our area sales across our area. And yes, that is one of the big things when anybody applies for DHP, is that there is not the opportunity to move. Of our DHP spend at the moment, the 80% of it is going to size criteria, but I couldn't hone it down even further to say whether it's size criteria because someone can't move. There is a variety of reasons in there as well, but and just know 80% of our DHP spend is currently on size criteria.
Is it an issue in other places as well? The one-bedroom properties particularly I'm thinking about.
Certainly in South Lanarkshire, only 25% of our stock is one-bedroom properties. The turnover is slightly higher in terms of percentage over the past 3 years. It's been between 33 and 36% turnover of one bedrooms. So that in numbers, however, no way equates to the number of tenants who are affected by the under-occupancy charge and who, if they wanted to, wouldn't be able to downsize, not only because of the availability but also location and where it is. And in terms of people, the drivers for folk to want to move, there's bigger pulls on them wanting to stay where they are and trying to cope to make the payments than want to apply to downsize. We have introduced a letting initiative to give priority to anyone affected by these changes who wishes to downsize, but we are certainly not being inundated with applicants who wish to make that change, and we are able in a small way to facilitate that change. But given the turnover is not necessarily of the house type or in the areas that the applicants are looking for, the volume of turnover is not helping this issue.
We have very similar problems in Aberdeenshire, in that being a large rural authority, there's a shortage of one-bedroom properties, and that is the size of property, if you like, that most households affected by the size criteria would actually be looking for. The majority of our DHP applications are down to the size criteria, but again, I couldn't say within that whether it was because they wouldn't move. What we did find was that in the engagement exercise that we did in the run-up to the introduction of the size criteria, most households indicated that they didn't want to move. They felt that they would either be able to cope with the shortfall or were going to revisit their household budgets to try to do that rather than actually move out of the community.
Edinburgh's the same. I mean, it's close to 90% of DHP apps around under occupancy, no doubt.
Okay, thank you.
Kevin. Thank you, Convener. We've heard a lot during the course of welfare reform from ministers in Westminster that they're trying to make the system fairer, which many would dispute, and also to cut down on the level of bureaucracy of the benefit system. Yet today you describe, all of you have described, an increase in administration staff, who I wouldn't class as bureaucrats, I have to say. Quite a large increase in administration staff to help you deal with the onslaught that you obviously are facing. Do you have any indication as yet, and I know it's early days, how much additional cost there has been on your services because of that increase in administration staff? And if possible, could you maybe give us an idea of how much that's going to cost you over a year, if that's at all possible? Annette, maybe?
Some of the additional staff we've engaged are about the encouragement of the uptake of DHP, and we have an additional 10 staff who are in our benefits for changing team, and that's cost us almost £300,000. We have also appointed 4 members to the DHP processing team, additional 4, and that's over £100,000 for that. Our Money Matters Advice Service, which sits within Social Work Services, as I've said, have recruited additional staff, some permanent, which 2, and I think about 10 or 12 additional on a temporary basis, with a variety of sources of funding for that. And I don't know the value of that, but it'll be significant in terms of the numbers involved. On top of that, while we've not recruited additional staff, there are staff working additional hours to try and engage with tenants, not only around applications for DHP, but also to provide them with other wider advice, and also to engage with them around the rent arrears and the rent account. So staff are working additional hours, which we're having to fund for that particular task.
Your report to the committee, your submission to the committee, which I think is excellent, you talk about monitoring the DHP situation every week. Are the Council committed to monitor the additional costs and staffing that this change in policy has cost South Lanarkshire?
Certainly in terms of the additional burden, the costs I've outlined already are the costs which are the very visible costs of a new additional staff. What we haven't done thus far is really look at the additional hours that people are working, and certainly that's something going forward. If when we're asked to comment on the additional burden, whether it be from this committee or from COSLA, it's something that we have to look at and almost guesstimate the additional amount of resource. But certainly it's something corporately within South Lanarkshire we are trying to look at the full cost of the additional burden, and that's an exercise that's ongoing.
Currently we have 5 full-time extra members of staff working on discretionary housing payments, and we know that's a cost of £140,000. By the time we add in the contact we've had to make with tenants writing out, the actually extra physical administration, it's probably going to come in somewhere around £250,000 it will cost us in administration. Because this sits within a specialised discretionary budget team, which they had a specific budget for at the start of the year, we should pretty much know by the end of the year how much it has cost Dumfries and Galloway to administer this extra fund.
Susan?
We haven't taken on a large number of additional staff to administer discretionary housing payments. It was always part and parcel of the existing benefit officers' role, if you like. What we've tended to do is reprioritise the works that we've had and look at some of our systems and processes to, if you like, free up resources for it. And in particular, what we've done is looked at the cross-service working that we do, so that we remove elements of maybe duplication that were happening, so that housing visitors, when they go out, have that discussion about DHP and about ensuring that we're sharing information between the services to allow us to take a much more holistic approach to the customer.
I can only answer specifically around the benefit processing area, and I mentioned the 6 additional staff, which would be around 150,000. However, similar to other colleagues here, we have pulled in people from the Scottish Welfare Fund to sift and review. There have been other benefits processing staff to deal with peaks in demand. I mentioned housing officers, and the push to engage. There's citizens' advice as well. I don't think Edinburgh has got a complete picture of the additional cost at the moment.
Thank you. Convener, again, this sounds like cost shunting from Westminster onto local authorities and this Parliament in this case. One of the things which I've heard resonate almost the entire morning is round about that level of cooperation between benefit staff, housing officers, and Cliff there has just mentioned advice services, including citizens' advice. Can I ask about the pressures that are on your staff at this moment in time? Obviously, we hear a lot about the pressures that are on folk who are affected by these welfare reforms. And sometimes we don't take due cognizance of the staff who, through no fault of their own, are having to pick up the pieces in a lot of regards. Can I ask what morale is like in your offices, and what additional help, if you are providing, to help them through what are obviously pretty difficult circumstances for them to deal with too? Annette?
Across the whole breadth of our service, both housing and I think in benefits, we have seen an increase not only in the workload but in the flexibility required and resilience required from staff, as we've seen a number of changes, not only in legislation but also other areas where we expected changes to have happened by now, like universal credit to be introduced, which is delayed. And also a shift in position, both in the money that we've had available and in how we approach trying to engage with tenants who we thought would have engaged with us more readily. That has resulted in, as I say, staff having to be more resilient and put in that effort. We've also had to look at more training and support for staff. Housing officers form essentially our benefits or changing team, including some staff who were formerly in benefits, and that cross-fertilisation of knowledge and experience in terms of benefit awareness, welfare benefit awareness for housing officers, money advice, debt advice, looking at fuel costs and the holistic approach that they're having to take has meant that we've had to train and develop staff as we've gone on pre-April and since April because of the shift in position. Certainly it is impacting on us, there's no doubt about it, and as we see, we're halfway through the year and there's still big challenges in terms of engaging with the remainder who haven't yet spoken to us or contacted us, and also in terms of rent arrears increasing and that income to the council not being there, then again staff are aware of this and of course it must have an impact on them.
Resilience, and I think we can all be resilient for a while, particularly if you see a light at the end of the tunnel, but when you don't see that, often has an effect in folk, and I've got real concerns from what I've heard from other places about the impact that the reforms are having on folks who are having to deal with folk who are losing benefit and who are in some cases in a real state. So I just wonder if in the future you will be looking at how you can put in place coping mechanisms, if you like, so that you don't actually end up with staff who are unfit, who themselves are majorly affected by this change.
We're certainly, as I say, sort of providing additional training, development and support, I would say, to our staff to be able to deal with the challenges that this brings. A lot of our team who are managing to engage with tenants are actually getting a great sense of their ability to deliver a change and help, is encouraging staff not only to continue to what they're doing, but also to be able to share that with others in terms of encouraging others to apply that, they should become not afraid, if you like, to approach the council, and staff get a great sense of satisfaction out of being able to make a difference to those who they are helping. But I certainly take on board that we need to continue to support staff who are doing something slightly different than they probably were this time last year in terms of delivering both a housing service and a benefit service.
I would say certainly our frontline staff and housing benefit administration staff are really feeling the pressures of the changes. I think benefit staff historically are used to change. Benefits for us is constant change, but the level of change from this year has been unprecedented, and they've had to take that on and take it on board. Potentially they may not have a future or employment in housing benefits. So I think for staff on the front line it has been quite difficult. Certainly in Dumfries and Galloway, we're quite fortunate that a lot of the staff that I have in benefits have been there for a long time. They're very experienced and have taken that on board and continue to deliver a good service. But it is difficult for staff, and I do see that on a daily basis, and concerns for staff about their own future and dealing with tenants and customers who are in very difficult situations. And certainly I know my Scottish Welfare Fund team and DHP team see that on a daily basis, having to deal with very difficult customers and very difficult situations, and do find that difficult. And we have put procedures in place with our HR teams about how we do occupational therapy referrals to support any staff that are finding difficult situations. But we do monitor maximising attendance and any sickness levels as well, to ensure that if the staff are feeling pressures, that they have got some route out of it. It's something we're very conscious of.
Susan?
Yes, I'd like to reiterate what Annette and Lorna have said. We've had training and development programmes in place for staff related to the welfare reforms. I mean, the wider programme is a source of anxiety for staff, in addition to dealing with the increased workload and the pace of change. But we've been working closely with HR colleagues to look at ways in which we can support staff through our employee assistance scheme, making sure that we've got mechanisms in place to spot the early warning signs, if you like, to make staff aware of the scheme, to get them referred on if that's necessary. Benefit staff have over the years been very used to change, and it's perhaps easy to underestimate just how big a change this might be for, how this might affect them. But they're committed to delivering the best service that they can, to providing the best information that they can to the customer. And it's important that we put things in place to allow them to do that and get that sense of satisfaction from their job.
Cliff?
Yeah, I echo what my colleagues are saying. I would just say that the difficulties when we talk about benefits are that I'm sure all of us expected probably not longer than a year ago that we wouldn't have housing benefit new claims anymore. And the timetable keeps shifting, which is difficult because I'm sure most of us would agree that it probably takes 6 to 9 months minimum to train somebody in benefits, because at the back of that we're expected to be very accurate in the award of benefits, and the DWP expect us still to be very accurate. And if we're not accurate, there's big financial penalties. So there's quite a lot of conflicting pressures there. And so it makes it difficult to plan, and that has a big impact on the staff. If I can't get people up to speed and turnover's higher because, people thought benefits was disappearing, but now it's not. So how do you bridge that gap? So, yeah, it's not an easy time.
Annabelle.
Thank you, Peter. Picking up on a point that was made in the submission from Sir Lanarkshire Council, and if I just quote so page 3, paragraph 5, last para thereof, as a result of the additional funding recently provided by the Scottish Government, a review of the hardship test has been carried out and the qualifying criteria reduced. Applications which were refused due to the customer not meeting the criteria within the original hardship test are currently being reviewed, and DHP will be awarded on the basis of the revised test. Now, from our discussion already this morning, I understand that that is the case for across the board. And my question and concern relates then to what happens next. And indeed, Jamie Hepburn did start off by asking, in his questioning, looking to the future and anticipated funding reductions from the DWP. And of course, if that were to happen, there would be concomitant reductions in what the Scottish Government could do in terms of the applicable Westminster legislation. And therefore, the good work being done at the moment, where restrictions have been relaxed, and your staff who are currently working on the new revised guidelines and looking at previous cases, what planning then goes into a future scenario where all that would probably then have to be changed again because there would be a reduced budget? I just wonder because you have already taken steps which are excellent to be flexible and to adapt to funding that has become available. Likewise, all the signs are that as far as the DWP and the UK Government is concerned, funding will be reduced. That will in turn lead to funding being reduced that can be added by the Scottish Government. So where does that leave you in terms of this good work currently being done, where thresholds have been reduced, more people qualify? What planning is I mean, I know that you have just really introduced these changes, but because it's such a fast-moving scene, what thought has been given to what might have to be done in the next year or so?
I think we would certainly be planning to revise our discretionary housing payment policy again. We keep a close eye on whether it's achieving what we wanted it to do. And one of the things that we did by awarding, if you like, 80% of the shortfall was to build in the ability to reduce that percentage if necessary. At the start of the statement, when we thought we had a lot less money to spend, if you like, our range of awards was anything from 25 to 100, to take account of the fact that we were going to have to make, at that time, a small pot of money stretch as far as we possibly could. And we'll adopt that same process, if you like, should we find that the budgets are cut next time round. They're not, you know, the decision to do that may not be particularly palatable, but it's to try to offer as much assistance as we can to the greatest range of households affected.
And if I may, before the others come in, if they wish, obviously with universal credit still apparently in the pipeline, that could only really compound the impact of any reduction from the DWP and DHPs being available. I don't know if anybody else would like to.
Reflect a very similar position in Edinburgh, where we started off with the baseline budget, the DWP contribution. At that point, we had put in 6-month reviews because we were trying to educate, if you like, or guide people perhaps to change what they spent some of their money on, particularly around luxuries. And we still have in our policy today that we reserve the right to advise a claimant to reduce expenditure if we think it is unreasonably high. And that can be a difficult subject to broach on discussion, but similar to what Susan says, the policy would change back to looking, I think, at shorter review periods and more closely at income and expenditure accounts, in the realisation that we did not have DHP funding at the level we previously had.
Similar to colleagues for Dumfries and Galloway, we would revert our policy back to where it was at the start of the year, depending on the level of funding. I think that's the key for us. It's waiting on the announcements of how much funding is available, and then we would devise our policy in a suitable way. And similarly to what Cliff's saying, we would the same with income and expenditure. We have included in there, we'll look at expenditures where it's deemed as it's a luxury item, or it's an expenditure that is perceived that something could be done about. But as Cliff said, that's not an easy conversation to have with anyone. It's quite invasive and not particularly palatable for staff or the client themselves.
Just to echo again what colleagues have said, our policy has already been revised twice now in this calendar year in terms of our approach, and further revisions will no doubt have to happen if the funding levels are reduced, in terms of not only what tests and criteria we apply, but also the length of the award that we're able to give against each of the groupings.
Thank you. And can I just lastly ask briefly if there's any suggestion that there's any flexibility coming down the line in terms of the application by the DWP of its rules and guidance? Is there any suggestion that there's going to be any flexibility with respect to the application of the rules, the definitions, the carry-forward rules, any representations being made in that respect to try to at least give you, as local authorities, some greater discretion in what you do? As far as you're aware. If you're not aware, then you're not aware.
No, we're not aware of anything.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. Just following up a line of questions already pursued by my colleagues about who doesn't receive the awards. You've clearly identified the priorities you've given to people with disabilities, or people who've had housing adaptations, or those near retirement, or whatever else. But if up to 50% of those who might qualify are not coming forward at all, is that a cross-section, just an absolute cross-section of all those who qualify, or are there characteristics around those who are not coming forward? I think, Mr Driver, you said that you actually wrote out to 2,500. So having identified the 2,500, are you able to describe that 2,500 in any way? Do they have any particular characterisation?
No, we're really just able to identify anybody affected by under-occupancy that had not applied. So basically that's what we're aiming at. No specific breakdown.
Any of the other authorities? I think the DWP do ask for monitoring information now. I understand they were asking for information to be sent back in October. Do they ask for any information, even if it be anecdotal, on those who are not applying?
No, they only asked for information on the awards.
On those who are applying, right. So we really don't know. We can make an estimate as to the number of people not applying, but we don't know anything more about the unmet need there. Another question I just wanted to ask was about to what extent these awards are time limited. Originally, clearly, they're designed to be transitional payments, and I think, from what I gather, that you do award them either for 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, or maybe longer. But the picture seems to be emerging that you're making these awards and then you're renewing them. Is that the case? Are there any examples of awards that have been made of DHP that have then been ended? In other words, they've been made for 6 months and that's it? Susan Donald, maybe yours.
The maximum period of award in Aberdeenshire would be 12 months. At the end of that 12 months period, we would review whether or not it was appropriate to continue with the award. But in addition, there may be shorter periods of award. For example, somebody might be about to move to a smaller property where there would be no size criteria reduction. If that was going to happen in a month, 6 weeks, then that's what the level of the award would be, and we would stop the award at that point in time. We also tend to find that we have quite a high turnover, in terms of people's circumstances changing in Aberdeenshire, part of the economic buoyancy of the area. So some of these things, when they're taken into account, may affect an award.
Other areas?
Certainly in South Lanarkshire, for most awards back in April, from April rather, they were for a period of 3 or 6 months. What we've taken the opportunity to do at the end of each of those periods is review individual circumstances and make a re-award if their circumstances had remained the same or even worsened. So many of our applicants who received an award for 3 months have now received it for payments for 6 months, and we'll review it again. And again, those awarded 6 have now received 12 months DHP.
Can I just ask, what's going to happen after 12 months?
Have to reassess our applicants based on criteria set to reflect the revised budget for next year.
Do you have the discretion to award DHP payments again? If anybody has received a payment for 12 months, do you have the discretion to award it for another period at all? 3 months, 6 months or 12 months?
We can award it for a longer period. I think most authorities will follow the line. They will apply up to the end of that financial year, depending on, and wait and see what their funding is going to be available for the next year. Because again, it's about making a commitment to a tenant that financially we may not be in a position to meet if we don't know what our funding is. So ourselves, like most authorities, will make a maximum award of 12 months up to the 31st of March and not beyond until we know what our funding arrangements are going to be.
Can I just ask, what are you thinking though? I mean, what's the basis on which you're making these awards? Are you awarding, you've put a lot of effort into identifying those in need, giving them the awards. At the end of that period, are you expecting them to have adjusted, to have found smaller accommodation, or do you think that it's a problem deferred or postponed?
It will really depend on individual circumstances. There's some tenants who will apply and just that their circumstances aren't going to change, so potentially you will be making a re-award. And then there's other circumstances where tenants may have the opportunity to change their circumstances, whether it's gaining employment, whether it's moving, or whether it's a debt issue that they're working towards resolving. So there could be a whole variety of reasons for shorter or longer term awards.
Indeed, but I'm not. I understand the reason, but I'm just more thinking in terms of the local authorities' policy. Are you planning on the basis that most, or some, or a minority will no longer qualify for these awards?
And I can only speak for Dumfries and Galloway here, but certainly at this point in time, it's really dependent on funding arrangements. You know, there's no, we know we have a certain group of people that potentially will need that extension to their DHP come next year, but it's whether we will be in a financial position to do that. So again, we're waiting for announcements on funding before we can make a decision on if we were able to, how many we would be able to carry forward automatically.
Is that a case for all the authorities, that you're working on the basis of how much money you've got to allocate, rather than how many will have moved off or how many you can get to move off?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, very much so. That's, as I said, we started off with the minimum DWP contribution, quite rigid financial restrictions, and very short review periods. That's changed for the moment, but we await to hear what the funding is going to be in 14-15.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't have any other questions. Can I thank you all very much for your evidence this morning? And as the Deputy Convener said, when we saw the paper from South Lanarkshire, I was gobsmacked at the increase that had been indicated, but the further evidence we've had this morning shows that, you know, the changes that are taking place at local authority level, the demand on discretionary housing payments is becoming astronomical. And I just wonder how widespread that's known, that the spending more on bureaucracy to administer the huge increases in the demand, and also the pressure that's coming on local authority staff because of this additional pressure. I think we have to make sure that we're asking questions around that, and I hope that the committee will agree that we should be using this evidence this morning to write to Ian Duncan-Smith to make sure that he's aware of what we've heard this morning, and ask him to respond to the impact that has been presented here this morning. Committee agreement? Well, I think we should add that question as well, and just make sure we're asking that question on behalf of our local authorities, so that they can actually do a bit of planning and look forward to, you know, this issue with a bit more clarity. So your evidence this morning has been very, very helpful to the committee, so thanks very much for that. And I'll suspend the committee for a couple of minutes to go to our next item. Okay, our third and final item of business today is consideration of what action to take on petition 1468, which we heard last week. We took evidence on that petition from Mike Daly and other representatives from Govan Law Centre, as well as COSLA, the Chartered Institute of Housing, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and the Association of Local Authority Housing Officers. Since the petition was originally submitted in March 2013, the petitioner has been successful in having the proposal contained within the petition adopted by Jackie Bailey MSP as a potential member's bill. And whilst it would be for the Parliamentary Bureau to decide, it would seem likely that the Welfare Reform Committee would consider any resulting bill. The committee will also shortly be considering a report on the subject matter of the petition, that is the bedroom tax, and could incorporate evidence that's received on the petition within that report. We have a proposal then in front of the committee. It's a proposal for discussion that the Welfare Committee take no further action on petition 1468 and close consideration of the petition. What do members think? Linda?
I agree with the recommendation, but it's just a point of clarification, really. I'm just, the procedure when I presume the Public Petition Committee put this to us. So do we have a response to them to make, or do we just incorporate the evidence in our own report and say to them that's our response? So.
I think
we would close the petition, but certainly we'd inform them that we've done that.
So just to clarify, this isn't a report, is it? We're not making any formal report.
No, so we take the evidence then that we got for that and incorporate it into our bedroom, or sorry, our,
I think that's
what's the right name for it? The bedroom tax report. Are there?
Altogether more accurate than the ones you suggest.
Okay, Ken, you want to, well, yeah, that seems to be Linda. I think the answer to your question is, I think out of courtesy we would inform the committee whatever we decide this morning, and the information we've had, we can use that as we go forward with our own inquiry. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would be perfectly happy to be saying to them, well, we've got a bedroom tax report coming out, so we'll incorporate any evidence we took on it in that.
Ken, you wanted to make a point?
Yes, a couple of things. I have to say I was very surprised at this recommendation, given the evidence we had last week, and I certainly don't agree with it. I think that, just on the first point, I think it would be very odd to rely on a private member's bill as a vehicle for, if what we're saying is that this is an important issue, it's so important that we might need to legislate on it, but we're going to rely on a private member to take that forward. That's a very unsatisfactory way. Private members' bills are a bit of a lottery, to put it mildly. There are many reasons why they get taken forward or don't get taken forward, and it certainly is no substitute for either executive action or committee action. So for the committee to rely on somebody else who's not a member of this committee, much as I wish Jackie every success in this, for us to rely on her, I just don't see that as a satisfactory conclusion whatsoever. That aside, the evidence last week left me, well, I suppose confused would be the politest way of putting it, between whether or not, what is the difference between the petitioner's call for a no eviction, a piece of legislation guaranteeing no eviction for the bedroom tax, and the Scottish Government's support for Council's no eviction policy. I am entirely baffled as to the difference between the two, and I think that for the committee just to let that pass now, and not at the very least to write to the Minister and ask her for an explanation specifically on that point, but particularly in response to the petition, I think it would be, I have to say, it would be ridiculous. And I think the petitioners and the public would be baffled as why we would not take any further action.
That's a recommendation from Ken that we write to the Scottish Government on it.
Sorry, can I come in on just what the paper's proposing? I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable what's being proposed. I mean, I'm not baffled. I thought the evidence actually was very clear on that point, and indeed in many other points, in terms of the preponderance of evidence last week about all the issues and the technical difficulties of proceeding in the way that the petition has suggested. But I mean, I think that the recommendation that we have before us is a very reasonable one, that there's no formal report, as the convener has rightly said this morning. What we're proposing to do is to close the petition. What we're also noting is, of course, that we're having our own inquiry into the bedroom tax, and that we should rightly look at the evidence session of last week as part of our evidence in that session. And I think that's the way forward. Once we have our report on the bedroom tax, presumably at that point we'd be wanting to do a number of things with it, including seek responses from the Scottish Government and perhaps others on our conclusions. I think that's the way forward. We shouldn't preempt our own inquiry at this stage, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, Annabelle's really, in essence, made the point I was going to make. I think just in response to what Ken said, I mean, I don't think we're suggesting at any stage that we're relying on the fact that there's a member's bill. We're just noting that as part of the context that the petitioner has been successful in persuading a member to take forward the proposal they have set out by way of petition. So it's just to by way of backdrop, rather than saying we're relying on any individual member taking it forward. I think Annabelle has really set out the wider context, and we are looking at the bedroom tax already. We'll continue to look at the bedroom tax. How can we avoid looking at the bedroom tax? Convener, we know that we've got that on our work programme. We can incorporate the useful evidence. I thought some of the evidence we took last week was very helpful in our wider consideration of the bedroom tax. We can work that into the work we're doing on an ongoing basis, and I fully back the recommendation that's been presented by the clerk.
Is it possible, because I'm trying to achieve a consensus here so we don't divide, is it possible that we could do both, that we could write to the government and, you know, wait until we get a response back before closing it, or do members think that's it, we just accept the position? Linda?
I suspect the Public Petitions Committee's already done that.
Because we actually discussed Margaret Burgess's response last week, but Ken's asked a specific question about part of that response from the government. Ken, you wanted to...
Just for information, my understanding that since last week there's been an eviction under the bedroom tax. The point about is, we, as a committee, we're looking at the impact of the bedroom tax, but this is very specifically talking about a no eviction policy. It's not just about the bedroom tax, we're looking at that. This is specifically about a no eviction policy. Now, if it's true, for example, that there was an eviction last week because of the bedroom tax, then I think there's even greater reason for clarity. And to shut this down, you know, it just strikes me as strange. We haven't come to a view on it as a committee. We haven't expressed a view on it. Well, we're closing the
we have to take a decision. There's a recommendation in front of us. Ken has put a counter recommendation. We're not going to get agreements. The only way we can decide on that is to put it to the committee. Ken has suggested, I think, that we write for clarification on the questions that he's raised. Do members support that proposal? All those, well, I suppose we have to divide on it then. Those who support Ken's proposal? Sure. Those against? And therefore we're left with the recommendation, which is that we close the petition. All those in favour? And those against?
Can I just clarify?
Yeah,
We're
sure.
not closing the petition. We're closing our consideration.
Yeah,
of
that's
it.
fine.
Yeah.
Closing our consideration of the petition.
It's the Petitions Committee.
That's the
closes
recommendation as in the paper. Yeah. Okay, but we will write to the Petitions Committee with that outcome and let them know how it progressed. Okay. And with that, I close this meeting. Our next meeting will be on the 3rd of December.